Hello, welcome back to Thinking Deliberately. This is episode 21, The Deliberate Thinking Consultant. I'm quite looking forward to this episode. In the last episode, we looked at culture as a recurring pattern of permission and consequence. We ended with a problem. The people with the greatest authority to change a culture may also be the people whose construction the culture protects. A board cannot easily observe the frame through which it is observing. It's the same old principle, you can't read the label of the jar you're stuck in. An executive team may ask for honesty while remaining unaware of what its own responses make safe to say. So, who helps senior authority see its participation in the pattern? Enter the consultant. Do I consider myself a consultant? I don't know. Briefcase optional. Slide deck almost inevitable. Consultancy has become one of the great rituals of organisational life. Something is not working, performance is drifting, strategy is unclear, transformation is not landing, and the board's concerned. Well, the executive team is divided, that's why. So let's get in a consultant. They might interview people, gather data, identify themes. If you haven't seen Office Space from 1999, please watch it. And then they benchmark performance and build a model. Maybe even produce a roadmap and present it to the board. Everyone nods at the appropriate slides and the report is impressive. The invoice has achieved transformation. And 6 months later, the organisation is using new language to reconstruct the old problem. Now, maybe not always. Some consultants do excellent work. Organisations sometimes need expertise they do not possess. They may need legal advice, technical knowledge, specialist analysis, or experience from another context. Sometimes the responsible thing is to give a clear answer. If the building is on fire, this is not the moment to ask how the board has constructed smoke. Expertise matters. The problem is not that consultants provide answers. The problem is when answer giving is mistaken for development. The organisation has a problem. The consultant frames it, interprets it, solves it, packages it. The organisation receives the answer but remains dependent on the construction that made the answer necessary. It has bought a map. That's my AQ8, and from Korzybski, the map is not the territory. It has not learned how it maps. And the polished answer can make the original construction harder to question. It now has charts, external validation, a respected logo in the corner. The frame that should have been examined has acquired institutional confidence. The board feels more certain, but it may not be more aware. And that is the developmental risk of outsourced thinking. That is the territory of the deliberate thinking consultant. The deliberate thinking consultant does not think instead of the board. They help the board observe how it is thinking while consequential decisions are being made. Their subject is not only the decision, it is the construction of the decision environment. What has been made relevant? What has disappeared? Which interpretation arrived early, already dressed as fact? Whose awareness counts and what is power making easier to say? The consultant helps the room to see the frame that is organising its attention. That is different from merely bringing another perspective into the frame. In CDT terms, the role resembles a more complex other. The phrase can sound grander than it needs to. It does not mean a superior person. It does not mean the consultant is more intelligent than the board. And it certainly doesn't mean that they have been appointed the adult in a room full of children. A more complex other temporarily holds a perspective the current construction cannot yet hold for itself. They preserve complexity without taking away agency. They make another level of awareness available and then return the thinking to the people responsible for the decision. And that last part is actually quite important. The board must still decide. The consultant must not become a shadow director or an unaccountable authority or the clever voice everyone waits to hear. The role is metacognitive. It helps the room to see itself constructing. Now, let us make that practical. Imagine a board discussing a transformation program that is 6 months behind. The papers describe poor adoption, middle management resistance, inconsistent communication. The proposed response is more communication, clearer accountability, and a renewed engagement campaign, all perfectly plausible and obvious. The conversation begins with solutions because the problem has already been constructed. The employees are resistant, the managers are inconsistent, and the message has not landed. Leadership sits outside the frame as the concerned observer of everybody else's failure. A conventional expert might assess the communication plan and recommend improvements. A deliberate thinking consultant may begin somewhere else. Before we improve the solution, how have we constructed the problem? The room might pause. Not for too long, obviously. There is a packed agenda. The consultant continues. What evidence would make the current frame wrong? Whose experience is represented in these papers? Whose is absent? And what have people learned will happen if they challenge the program? What is the leadership team being asked to reconsider? That last question may create a small weather event because the board begins to notice that the change is asking everyone except its sponsors to change. The operating model remains unresolved. Two senior leaders are giving contradictory instructions. Targets reward the old behavior. Local managers are carrying the cost of an ambiguity created above them. What had been constructed as resistance now includes intelligent self-protection, conflicting consequences, and an unfinished leadership decision. The consultant has not supplied the new strategy. They have expanded the decision environment. More of the territory is now available. The board has more choices because it can see more of its own participation. That is developmental consultancy in action. But there is an important discipline here. The consultant cannot simply fire increasingly clever questions at the room and call the discomfort development. Challenge has to be useful. In CDT, we might describe this as working at AQ+1. We encountered this a couple of episodes ago. Not 10 levels beyond what the room can currently hold, not so familiar that nothing moves, one reachable expansion in awareness. The next distinction the board can genuinely use. So perhaps the room can already debate competing solutions, but cannot yet observe the frame producing them. The intervention moves from content to construction. Perhaps the room can see its assumptions, but cannot see how power determines which assumptions survive. The intervention makes consequence and authority visible. AQ+1 is not a performance of complexity, it is calibrated development. Too little challenge and the consultant becomes a facilitator of the existing construction. Too much and the room may defend itself, comply politely, or admire the consultant without becoming more capable. The aim is not to win the intellectual encounter, the aim is to increase what the board can notice and use. So what does the role require? First, clarity of contract. What has the consultant actually been invited to do? Provide expertise, facilitate a decision, legitimize a decision already made, maybe even challenge a frame. For me, it would be to develop the board's capacity. And these are not all the same assignment. Dependency often begins in the contract. If the board has secretly bought certainty, it may punish genuine inquiry for failing to provide it. A deliberate thinking consultant makes the developmental purpose explicit, including the authority to interrupt how the room is constructing the issue. Second, disciplined observation. They listen to content, but also to patterns. Where does uncertainty disappear? When does data become a story? And which cognitive intentions are repeatedly privileged in this context? Does the room generate options but avoid procedures and commitment? Does it move towards the desired result while editing out away from information about risk? Does an internal locus of evaluation become conviction or insulation? The consultant does not diagnose the board as a type. They make a recurring orientation visible in the live decision. So third, constructional challenge. They ask questions that reveal the frame rather than merely decorate the discussion. What have we already assumed by calling this the problem? What are we treating as fact that is actually interpretation? And which outcome does this framing protect? What would become thinkable if a different voice defined the issue? These questions are not magic phrases. Used badly, they become consultant theatre. Their value comes from timing, evidence, and the consultant's ability to connect the question to what the room is now doing. Fourth, ethical interruption. Sometimes a consultant must name a contradiction. We are calling this empowerment while retaining every meaningful decision. Or we are describing this as a capability problem, but the evidence points to conflicting incentives. So the interruption should be clear without becoming humiliating. Challenge without care becomes domination. Care without challenge becomes collusion, and the work requires both. Fifth, developmental transfer. The consultant models a method, teaches the distinctions, and builds them into real board level work. Decision reviews, strategy conversations, risk discussions, and executive meetings. Not a workshop that briefly makes everyone fluent in new nouns. Repeated practice in the moments where construction becomes consequence. Over time, board members begin to interrupt themselves. We've moved to solutions before examining the frame, or we're treating absence of challenge as agreement. At that point, the consultant's value has transferred. They are becoming less central because the board is becoming more capable. This is not a commercial weakness. It is evidence that the work has succeeded. Of course, no consultant is neutral. They bring a construction too. Their method directs attention, and their questions privilege certain distinctions. Their status changes what people will say. Their relationship with the chair, chief executive, or sponsor affects how the room interprets them. So the consultant must observe their own participation. Am I expanding the board's awareness or steering it towards my preferred answer? Am I naming evidence or performing insight? Now, as I think about this personally, at the higher levels, at AQ8, you're not going to steer anything towards your own preferred answer. So some of these consultants are going to be their response is based on their level of construction themselves. So, am I reducing dependency or making the method mysterious enough to require me forever? Now, I hate that idea. And this is where the role becomes demanding. Expertise without possession, authority without domination, challenge without humiliation, and support without collusion. And the capacity to give an answer when the answer is genuinely what the situation requires without confusing the answer with development. That for me would be an AQ8 consultant. Boards need this because governance is not only the review of outputs, it includes the conditions under which information becomes available, challenge becomes possible, and decisions become thinkable. So boards routinely ask whether the numbers are accurate. They should also ask how the numbers have organised attention. They ask whether the risk register is complete. Well, they should also ask which risks the current strategy makes difficult to name. They ask whether management has consulted widely, and they should also ask whether those voices altered the decision or merely appeared in the process. They ask whether the recommendation is supported by evidence, and they should ask what interpretation turned that evidence into this recommendation. They are not softer alternatives to governance. They are questions about how governance receives reality. A board can receive excellent reports and still construct reality badly. It can have more data than awareness. It can comply with every ritual while the decisive assumption remains untouched. The deliberate thinking consultant deepens governance by helping the board examine those conditions. Not as the guardian of organisational thought. The board cannot outsource that responsibility either. The consultant temporarily helps the board govern the quality of its own construction and then leaves capability behind. So the success measure is not whether the consultant sounded clever, not whether the board loved the framework, and not whether the final deck contained an exciting arrow. The test is whether the board can see and challenge more of its own construction when the consultant is no longer in the room. Can it distinguish information from interpretation? Can it notice what power makes unsayable? Can it recover choices that its first frame excluded? And can it hold uncertainty long enough to construct a better response? If it can, consultancy has become developmental. If it cannot, there may still have been expertise, useful analysis, and a good report, but the organisation has not necessarily developed. And this creates the question for our next episode. If we want to understand the awareness available across an organisation, what exactly should we examine? We cannot average a set of individual scores and pretend the organisation has a single mind. We need to look at what awareness is available, permissible, and consequential across the system. That is where we go in the next episode, organisational AQ profiling. So for now, here is the uncomfortable thought. The best consultant is not the one the board cannot think without. It is the one who helps the board notice more, choose more deliberately, and eventually conduct the work without them. That is thinking deliberately. Thank you.